Awaken your spirit chosen ones. They wanted your downfall to be the city's entertainment, but the show backfired when you refused to play the fool. There's a certain kind of silence that follows public humiliation, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a person who knows too much to respond. What most people don't understand is that humiliation rituals aren't superstition. They're social experiments dressed as accidents. History is full of them. One person singled out, stripped of dignity, then observed like a specimen while the crowd laughs, not realizing they're the real subjects being tested. The chosen one is never punished for what they did. They're punished for what they carry. You didn't just survive embarrassment, you survived exposure. The ritual wasn't random, it was rehearsed, premeditated, and broadcast through whispers disguised as concern. They wanted to rewrite your character before your purpose had its debut. But here's the cosmic joke. They performed their part so desperately that they forgot you were the main storyline. It's funny how people claim they want truth but panic when it walks in wearing your face. They wanted your reputation to rot publicly, but the only thing that decayed was their own disguise. Because discernment, that quiet internal radar, doesn't just detect lies, it decodes intentions. And once you see who's who behind the curtain, humiliation loses its sting. Your survival wasn't luck, it was literacy in energy. You read their manipulation like a badly written script. You sensed the setup, adjusted your response, and let divine timing serve the final punchline. And oh, the irony, the same mouths that tried to bury you now quote your strength like scripture. So no, you didn't just walk away from a humiliation ritual. You walked out with receipts, revelations, and a rebirth. What they designed as your undoing became your unveiling. The crowd thought they were watching a breakdown, but history was watching a breakthrough. Number one, they weren't testing your strength. They were measuring your silence. When people try to humiliate you, it's rarely about your strength. It's about your reaction. They already know you can endure pain. They just want to know if you'll expose them while you're in it. That's what made your silence so dangerous. You didn't give them the chaos they were counting on. They wanted noise, drama, proof that they had power over your emotions. Instead, you gave them stillness, the kind that makes manipulators uncomfortable because it leaves them talking to their own guilt. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was data. You were watching, analyzing, understanding who stood where. Every smirk, every innocent question, every fake show of sympathy revealed a pattern. They thought you were numb, but you were just taking notes. And that's what shifted everything. You refused to play their game. Because humiliation rituals are just traps designed to make you react emotionally so they can justify what they've already planned spiritually. But discernment doesn't take the bait. It studies the setup. They expected you to explode, defend yourself, or crumble. Anything that would make their performance believable. When you didn't, it exposed how scripted the whole thing was. Your silence became the spotlight that turned back on them. It revealed who was lying, who was enabling, and who was secretly jealous of the strength they pretended to test. Suddenly, the story stopped being about your humiliation and started being about their obsession with it. There's something powerful about a person who can stay still in the storm. It's not because they're scared or unsure. It's because they've already won internally. You knew what was happening long before anyone said a word. Your discernment didn't just save your peace, it saved your destiny. Because the minute you reacted, you would have validated their illusion. But by staying composed, you forced truth to reveal itself on its own. And that's why you survived. Not because you were stronger, but because you were wiser. You understood that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it watches in silence until every hidden motive exposes itself. You didn't just pass their test, you flipped it. They measured your silence and found it louder than their lies. Number 2, humiliation was the disguise of initiation. What looked like humiliation was actually transformation in disguise. They thought they were breaking you down, but they were unintentionally stripping away everything that wasn't meant to continue with you. The loss, the embarrassment, the whispers, none of it was random. It was a process designed to expose what your confidence was built on. When everything external fell apart, all that was left was the part of you that couldn't be touched. The real you. Humiliation has a strange way of revealing who's authentic and who's pretending. When your name was dragged, the ones who clapped were exposed, and the ones who stood silently beside you were revealed. The entire experience became a sorting ground, separating the loyal from the opportunistic. And while the world saw it as your lowest point, it was actually the moment your discernment reached mastery. You began to see through people, through performances, through pity that wasn't pure. You learned that not everyone around you claps for healing. Some only cheer for harm. Initiations don't always come wrapped in light. Sometimes they come wrapped in shame. The humiliation wasn't punishment, it was purification. It burned away your ego's need for validation. You stopped trying to prove who you were and started remembering who you already are. You began to understand that real power doesn't need defending. It simply exists. That was your initiation, the moment you stopped chasing acceptance and started walking in awareness. The people who tried to humiliate you thought they were destroying your name, not realizing they were helping reveal your purpose. Because humiliation, for a chosen one, always precedes elevation. It's life's way of saying, you're about to enter rooms where ego can't survive. The embarrassment wasn't meant to degrade you, it was meant to detach you from everything fragile. It forced you to anchor your identity in truth, not approval. So, while they thought they were burying you under shame, they were unknowingly planting you deeper into purpose. You didn't lose respect, you lost illusions. You didn't fall, you were refined. The ritual wasn't meant to destroy your light, it was meant to prepare your spirit for the level where imitation can't exist. Humiliation wasn't your ending. It was your initiation into authenticity. Number 3, they needed you to doubt your own vision. So theirs could reign. When your clarity became too sharp, it started to threaten their comfort. You began to see through things they still depended on, lies, power games, fake loyalty. That's when the subtle attack started, not with weapons, but with words designed to make you question yourself. They couldn't destroy your purpose directly, so they aimed to blur your vision. Because once a chosen one starts second-guessing their own discernment, manipulation becomes effortless. They needed you confused so they could stay relevant. As long as you believed their version of truth, you'd stay small enough to fit inside their story. They played on your empathy, your trust, your desire to see good in people. They twisted your intuition into insecurity. They called your insight paranoia and your awareness pride. It was never about right or wrong, it was about control. The moment you began to doubt your spiritual eyesight, you started leaning on their opinions for direction. That's how they stayed in charge of your narrative. But discernment is a stubborn gift. It doesn't die, it just gets quieter. Deep down, you always knew what was going on. Even when you tried to silence your intuition, it never stopped speaking. It whispered through disappointment, through betrayal, through those moments when your spirit felt uneasy without reason. Eventually, the truth you tried to suppress began surfacing everywhere, in conversations, coincidences, timing. That was your awakening. You realized they weren't trying to help you see clearly. They were trying to dim your insight so their shadows could stay hidden. The moment you trusted your vision again, everything changed. Their influence lost its grip because control only works when confusion exists. Once you started believing in what you sensed instead of what they said, the spell broke. They could no longer feed off your doubt. You reclaimed your inner authority, that quiet confidence that doesn't need validation to know it's right. Their strategy failed because truth has endurance. Lies require maintenance, and you stopped being their maintenance worker. You saw the game, and instead of arguing, you elevated. You understood that your clarity was never arrogance. It was awareness. And when awareness returns, illusion collapses. They needed you to doubt your vision, but your discernment reminded you it was never wrong, just waiting for you to trust it again. Number 4. They didn't betray you. They exposed themselves in advance. What they called betrayal was actually an early warning from the universe. It wasn't a surprise attack, it was a preview. Their actions showed you everything you needed to know about their character before you gave them deeper access to your future. The ritual they performed, the gossip, the humiliation, the subtle discrediting, wasn't random. It was an unintentional confession. People who plan to harm you can't hide their intentions forever. Their energy always leaks through their behavior. And when yours is pure, you pick it up instantly. They thought they were fooling you, but your spirit had already seen the cracks. You watched them celebrate your pain under the disguise of concern, and that was all the confirmation you needed. You didn't need to expose them. They did it themselves by overplaying their role. Every move they made to shame you ended up revealing their true motives: jealousy, resentment, and fear of your evolution. They didn't betray you out of sudden hatred. They betrayed you because your growth made their masks unbearable. Betrayal hurts less when you realize it's just truth arriving uninvited. It's divine mercy disguised as emotional chaos. What they meant for your embarrassment turned into your enlightenment. They thought they were destroying your image, but they were actually destroying the illusion you still had of them. Once you saw their true nature, the attachment broke and the energy cleared. Your discernment didn't just protect your peace. It exposed the blueprint of their intentions before they could fully execute it. You didn't lose loyal people. You lost opportunists who were never built for your next level. They revealed themselves early, so you wouldn't take them where your purpose is headed. The ritual was their undoing, not yours. They showed their cards too soon, thinking you were too hurt to notice. But you did. You read every action, every whisper, every sudden change in tone, and instead of reacting, you understood. That's the power of discernment. It doesn't seek revenge, it simply observes and remembers. Their betrayal wasn't a shock, it was evidence. They didn't ruin anything, they just confirmed everything. The exposure wasn't your loss, it was your liberation. They didn't betray you, they warned you. Number 5. You didn't lose your dignity. You lost their illusion of it. When they tried to humiliate you, their goal wasn't to take your power. It was to convince others you never had any. They wanted to rewrite how people saw you, hoping you'd crumble under the pressure of public opinion. But what they didn't realize is that dignity isn't a costume you wear for approval. It's the quiet integrity that stays when applause disappears. You didn't lose your dignity. You lost the version of it they invented, the one that existed only as long as you played small enough to keep them comfortable. Their ritual wasn't about destroying your reputation. It was about maintaining their illusion of control. They needed you to believe that external validation defined your value. They wanted you to chase approval so they could withhold it and feel powerful. But when humiliation came, it stripped away every illusion of worth that depended on them. It exposed who was performing and who was real. You stopped caring about being liked and started caring about being aligned. That's the irony. What they thought would degrade you actually refined you. The embarrassment forced you to see how much of your identity had been tied to perception. It revealed how easily people confuse image with integrity. You walked through public shame and discovered something sacred. Real dignity doesn't live in how people treat you. It lives in how you treat yourself when they don't. And that realization changed everything. You stopped performing for acceptance. You stopped explaining yourself to the misinformed. You stopped bending to make insecure people feel tall. That loss, the loss of illusion, was the beginning of your freedom. You became unshakable because you no longer needed external validation to confirm what your spirit already knew. They thought they'd ruined your name, but all they did was expose how fragile their opinions were. They mistook public perception for power. You learned that peace doesn't come from being seen a certain way. It comes from knowing you don't owe anyone proof of who you are. So no, you didn't lose your dignity. You lost the fake version they created for their comfort. What remains is your essence, untamed, grounded, and immune to performance. Number 6. You were the mirror. They couldn't break without seeing themselves. The people who targeted you weren't driven by random hate. They were reacting to their own reflection. Something about you reminded them of everything they lost, denied, or betrayed within themselves. Your light wasn't offensive because it was bright. It was offensive because it revealed how dim they had become. They couldn't handle your authenticity because it made their pretenses uncomfortable. You didn't threaten their position. You threatened their illusion of it. That's why their attempts to humiliate you felt personal. It wasn't just jealousy. It was projection. Every insult, every rumor, every attempt to make you look small was their way of trying to silence the guilt echoing inside them. They saw in you the courage they never exercised, the innocence they traded for manipulation, and the peace they couldn't manufacture no matter how much they pretended. You weren't their enemy, you were their evidence, and evidence terrifies the guilty. They tried to shatter you because facing you meant facing themselves. But mirrors don't break easily when they're built from truth. Every attempt to distort your image only revealed more of their distortion. The more they mocked you, the more their own emptiness showed. It's almost poetic. They wanted the world to see you as flawed, yet the performance only highlighted their own spiritual bankruptcy. Their obsession wasn't about destroying you, it was about avoiding themselves. You didn't need revenge because life handled that balance naturally. Over time, the same reflection they ran from began following them. The same exposure they planned for you came for them. Not because you wished it, but because energy always returns home. You stayed grounded, authentic, and unbothered, and that alone became your justice. The mirror they tried to break stood firm, forcing them to finally see what they'd been running from all along. In the end, your presence became their lesson. You reminded them that pretending doesn't purify, and destroying someone else's truth doesn't rebuild your own. They wanted to erase the mirror, but they only erased their masks. You didn't fight back with hate. You simply kept being real. And that's what shattered them the most. They couldn't handle a reflection that refused to lie. Number 7. The stage they built to mock you became their own trial. They planned the entire scene thinking they were in control. The whispers, the rumors, the fake concern, the audience ready to laugh. They built a platform to embarrass you, convinced that humiliation would silence your spirit. But what they didn't understand was that truth always turns the table when the performance is built on deceit. The same stage they created to display your downfall became the courtroom of their own exposure. They gathered an audience to ridicule you, not realizing those same witnesses would one day remember everything and recognize who the real liar was. When they mocked you, You stayed centered. You didn't rush to defend yourself or explain, because deep inside you knew something they didn't. False narratives eventually collapse under their own weight. That's why you didn't need revenge. You understood that exposure isn't something you force. It's something that unfolds naturally when people overplay their role. They became so desperate to prove your unworthiness that they ended up documenting their deceit. Every insult they threw became evidence of their envy. Every performance they staged became a confession of how much energy they invested in pretending you were the problem. And when the mask began to crack, all those spectators who once laughed began to notice inconsistencies, things that didn't add up, stories that shifted, faces that revealed guilt. What started as entertainment turned into discomfort. What they meant to be your public disgrace became their public unraveling. The irony is that they didn't realize how divine justice works. It doesn't shout, it exposes through timing. They made you the headline of their mockery, but you ended up being the proof of their hypocrisy. You didn't have to fight for redemption. Your integrity spoke for itself. You simply walked away while the stage they built caught fire under the weight of their own lies. That's how truth operates. It doesn't need your defense. It needs your endurance. The more they tried to perform your failure, the more their character came undone. The ritual flipped. The crowd saw what they weren't meant to see. And in the end, you didn't just survive the show. You walked away vindicated, while they were left explaining their own act. Number 8. Your spirit, read the room. Before the room, read you. You didn't stay quiet because you were intimidated. You stayed quiet because your spirit had already scanned the atmosphere. Discernment gave you X-ray vision before anyone else even noticed what was brewing. You could feel the tension that others tried to hide under smiles. You sensed the energy shift in conversations, the subtle tones, the unspoken competition. You were never late to awareness. You were simply wise enough not to expose what you knew too soon. That silence wasn't fear. It was calculation born from spiritual intelligence. You saw the trap before they even set it. The fake concern, the strategic compliments, the carefully placed questions. All of it had intention behind it. But you didn't react, because you understood that reacting prematurely feeds manipulation. You let them believe you were unaware, all while observing every move. That's how you survived, not by luck, but by strategy. People underestimate how powerful it is to know without announcing it. You mastered the art of patience, and patience became your armor. When you read the room, you realize something essential. Most people reveal their motives without realizing it. Their tone tells on them. Their timing betrays them. Their sudden interest in your peace always has a motive. Your discernment didn't just alert you, it trained you to respond with precision. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped trying to prove loyalty to those who were only loyal to their advantage. You learned that silence speaks in frequencies words can't reach. That's why you weren't shaken when things fell apart. You had already sensed the energy months before it showed up in reality. You weren't caught off guard. You were simply letting divine timing do its work. You saw the storm but didn't panic, because discernment doesn't just warn, it prepares. You conserved your energy, kept your peace, and let exposure happen naturally. That's what spiritual strategy looks like, knowing when to move and when to stay still, when to speak and when to observe. You weren't avoiding confrontation, you were protecting revelation. Your spirit read the room before the room read you, and that's why you walked out untouched while everyone else was still trying to decode what just happened. Number 9. They didn't want you destroyed. They wanted you discredited. Their goal was never to end you physically. It was to assassinate your credibility. They knew they couldn't break your strength, so they attacked your image. They understood that if people stopped believing you, everything you said afterward would sound like noise. That's how character assassinations work. They don't need to kill your body. They just need to distort your truth. Their real weapon wasn't violence, it was disbelief. If they could make others doubt your integrity, they could rewrite your story while you were still living it. They studied your patterns, your words, even your silence, then twisted them to fit their agenda. They used half-truths as tools, exaggerations as evidence, and gossip as gospel. It was psychological warfare. They didn't come for your possessions, they came for your perception. And the saddest part is, some people believed them, not because the lies made sense, but because the truth you carried was too bright for their comfort. It's easier for people to believe a lie that flatters their bias than a truth that challenges their blindness. But time has a way of clarifying what deceit tries to blur. Their stories began to contradict themselves. Their obsession with discrediting you became suspicious. Eventually, the same people they tried to convince started noticing patterns, the jealousy, the exaggerations, the inconsistencies. They realized that the person being accused wasn't the problem. The ones doing the accusing were. That's how divine justice works. It doesn't always show up with thunder. Sometimes it shows up through exposure disguised as karma. You didn't defend yourself with words because you knew energy speaks louder. You stayed consistent. Same values, same truth, same peace. And that consistency became your defense. While they jumped from version to version of your story, you just kept living yours. That's what destroyed their plan. They expected you to panic, to argue, to beg people to believe you. But you didn't. You let time prove what words couldn't. In the end, their strategy collapsed under the weight of your authenticity. They wanted you discredited, but their obsession with making you look fake made them look unstable. You outlasted the narrative because truth always ages better than lies. They couldn't destroy you, so they tried to discredit you, and both attempts failed spectacularly. Number 10. They mistook your restraint for weakness, not knowing it was precision. You could have responded. You could have exposed, embarrassed, and dismantled every false narrative they built about you. But you didn't. Not because you were powerless, but because you understood something they didn't. Not every battle deserves your energy. You knew that responding to foolishness drains focus, and focus is sacred. They took your calm for fear, but it was really control. You weren't avoiding the fight. You were mastering the art of timing. That's what they'll never understand. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's strategy. Your restraint came from wisdom, not weakness. You had already learned that chaos feeds off reaction. The moment you answer manipulation with emotion, you validate its purpose. So instead of wasting your strength trying to convince people who were committed to misunderstanding you, you chose to let time do the talking. You let character reveal what conversation couldn't. That's the difference between ego and discernment. Ego needs to prove a point, but discernment lets proof arrive naturally. They expected you to lose control, to match their pettiness, to respond in a way that made you look unstable. They needed your reaction to complete their performance. But when you didn't give them that satisfaction, the scene fell apart. Without your energy, their drama lost direction. They exposed themselves trying to get a reaction out of someone who had already graduated from their level. That's when they realized your silence wasn't passive. It was precision. You were moving intentionally while they were performing emotionally. Restraint is misunderstood because it doesn't scream for attention. It's quiet power, the kind that knows exactly when to speak and when to let truth breathe on its own. You were never afraid to confront. You were just wise enough to recognize when confrontation wasn't worth it. You conserved your power for moments that mattered, and in doing so, You proved that strength isn't about how loud you respond. It's about how well you discern where your peace belongs. So let them misread your calm. Let them call it weakness. Eventually they'll realize that what looked like avoidance was actually precision. You didn't hold back because you couldn't fight. You held back because you already knew the outcome. Your silence wasn't surrender. It was self-mastery. Number 11. They scripted your humiliation, but you rewrote it into history. They planned your downfall like a story, carefully, deliberately, as if they were the authors of your fate. They wrote scenes of public embarrassment, orchestrated rumors, and planted seeds of doubt so that your name would wilt in the mouths of others. They wanted your story to end in shame, to make your silence look like defeat and your isolation look like proof of guilt. But they underestimated something vital. Chosen ones don't end where others expect. They evolve right in front of their critics. What they scripted as humiliation became the preface of your legacy. You didn't fight to clear your name. You let truth do the editing. Every insult, every whisper, every betrayal became documentation of your endurance. Their attempts to break you ended up validating your resilience. The more they pushed, the stronger your foundation became. What they called exposure became your evidence. What they meant as defamation turned into divine documentation. Time has a way of aging lies badly, but it matures truth into testimony. You didn't erase the story, you simply changed the narrative. Their ritual became your receipt. The public spectacle they created to destroy your reputation became living proof of how much pressure you could withstand without losing your peace. You didn't just survive it, you outlasted it. They wanted your name buried under shame, but all they did was bury their credibility under their own deceit. The same mouths that mocked you are now quiet, because exposure always comes with a sequel. And in that sequel, the villain never gets the last word. The survivor does. You turned pain into purpose, disgrace into depth, and rejection into revelation. You showed that history doesn't belong to those who gossip. It belongs to those who endure. What they meant as your ending became your evolution. You didn't need revenge. You became the reminder that humiliation doesn't define destiny. Response does. They wrote the script, but they forgot who the author was. And when it was all over, your story stood taller than their lies, etched permanently in truth. You didn't just rewrite it. You turned their ritual into your record of victory. Number 12. Their ritual failed. Because you were already initiated by pain. They believed their cruelty would shock you, that the humiliation would wound you so deeply you'd never recover. But what they didn't realize was that you had already walked through fire long before they tried to light their match. Pain was not new to you. It was a language you had already learned to translate into power. Their ritual failed because they brought suffering to someone who had already studied it, dissected it, and risen from it. You can't humiliate someone who has already confronted their own reflection and made peace with every scar. They assumed embarrassment would break your spirit, but pain had already built your backbone. You'd been rejected before and learned resilience. You'd been misunderstood and learned patience. You'd faced betrayal and discovered discernment. The pain they tried to use against you had already been transformed into wisdom long ago. What they thought was a weapon turned out to be useless against someone who'd already turned past wounds into armor. You didn't flinch because you recognized the pattern. Humiliation was just recycled energy in a new disguise. That's the thing about those who have been truly broken and rebuilt. They're immune to emotional blackmail. They no longer fear being seen at their lowest, because they've already met themselves there and survived it. They don't panic when people lie, because truth has already taught them patience. You didn't resist their attack with outrage. You disarmed it with awareness. You knew their goal wasn't to hurt you. It was to make you forget who you are. But pain had already taught you identity at its rawest form. They performed their ritual thinking they were exposing you, but all they did was reveal that they still feared the very emotions you had already mastered. They were trying to use shame as initiation, not realizing your initiation had already come through solitude, heartbreak, and loss. Their power was useless against someone who had already been to the bottom and found peace there. That's why you survived effortlessly, not by luck, but by graduation. You were already seasoned by suffering. They came with humiliation as if it were new, but you had already turned pain into prophecy. They wanted to break you, but you were already unbreakable. Their ritual failed before it even began. Number 13. Your discernment wasn't just protection. It was prophecy. You didn't stay calm because you were lost. You stayed calm because your spirit had already seen how it would end. The whole situation played out like a rerun your soul had already watched in silence. You didn't react to the chaos because you already knew who was pretending, who was plotting, and who was just playing along. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity that arrived too early for everyone else to understand. That's the mystery of discernment. It doesn't just keep you safe. It gives you a glimpse of how divine order will rearrange what others tried to destroy. While they were rehearsing their lies, you were watching prophecy unfold in real time. You knew their performance was temporary, so you let divine timing handle what your words couldn't. People mistook your stillness for uncertainty, but it was actually confidence. The kind that comes from already knowing truth doesn't need defending. Discernment gave you patience when ego wanted revenge. It told you, don't interrupt what's already about to expose itself. So you waited, and one by one, masks slipped, alliances cracked, and every false motive came to light exactly as your spirit predicted. That's what makes discernment sacred. It's not just intuition, it's divine scheduling. It alerts you not only to what's happening, but also to when it will be revealed. You didn't need to fight back because the fight was already fixed in your favor. You sensed that what was meant to humiliate you would eventually highlight you, that the same mouths used to spread lies would later be forced to acknowledge truth. And you were right. Prophetic discernment doesn't seek applause, it seeks alignment. It doesn't rush outcomes, it trusts divine choreography. That's why you seemed so unbothered. Your spirit wasn't guessing, it was remembering. You'd already seen the conclusion in the quiet places of your soul. So when the exposure finally came, you weren't shocked, you were simply fulfilled. They thought your calm was blindness, but it was vision in its purest form. You didn't need to predict. You simply perceived. Your discernment wasn't just protecting your peace, it was prophesying your victory. Everything unfolded exactly as your spirit said it would. Not by accident, but by divine design. Number 14. They wanted to make you a spectacle, but you became a symbol. They gathered to mock you, not realizing they were attending your unveiling. What they planned as a public execution of your image became a divine introduction of your purpose. They wanted to reduce you to entertainment, something to gossip about, ridicule, and dismiss. But the more they tried to make you a spectacle, the more your endurance turned you into a symbol. You stopped being a topic of laughter and became a lesson in survival. The same stage they used to shame you became the altar where your authenticity was crowned. That's the irony of divine justice. Humiliation has a strange way of amplifying what's real. Their goal was to bury your name under scandal and mockery, but they only ended up engraving it deeper into memory. The ones who once watched you fall now study how you stood back up. The same crowd that doubted your strength now uses you as reference when they talk about resilience. The ritual they designed to end your credibility became your coronation in disguise. Because when someone tries to destroy what's pure, they don't realize they're only strengthening its impact. The chosen never lose in public. They get refined in front of witnesses. Every insult became data. Every rumor became documentation. The moment they thought you were finished, your silence and steadiness rewrote the narrative. You became the symbol of what it means to be unshakable, proof that grace doesn't panic, it pivots. Now, your presence speaks louder than their performance ever could. You didn't need revenge. You became the reminder. You showed that being humiliated publicly doesn't end a story. It reveals who truly authored it. What they meant for defamation became definition. You are now the living evidence that chosen ones aren't destroyed by exposure. They are declared through it. The world no longer looks at you with pity. They look with realization. They see that what was supposed to be your downfall was actually your debut. You didn't just survive humiliation, you transformed it into history. And that's what they'll never understand. The spectacle they created became scripture. You didn't lose the stage, you inherited it. You survived what others thought would break you, not because you were invincible, but because you were awakened. Every humiliation, every scheme, every whispered betrayal was a test, not of your strength, but of your clarity, your discernment, and your integrity. While they plotted your fall, you were quietly gathering proof of their intentions, refining your spirit, and transforming every insult into a lesson, every attack into evidence, every moment of shame into a step toward your true power. They tried to write your story for you, but you refused to play the part they cast. What they meant as your undoing became your unveiling. The lies they spun turned into a mirror reflecting their own weaknesses. The energy they used to shame you became the momentum that elevated you. Humiliation wasn't your defeat, it was your initiation. Disrespect wasn't your end, it was your archive. And every attempt to diminish you only made your essence clearer, your presence sharper, and your destiny undeniable. By staying silent when others demanded noise, by holding your integrity when others traded theirs for approval, and by trusting your discernment when deception surrounded you, you proved something the world can't ignore. Chosen ones aren't defined by what they endure. They are defined by what they rise to become. You didn't just survive a ritual of shame. You converted it into history, into legacy, into evidence that truth, clarity, and self-mastery always outlast chaos and deception. Your journey is proof that humiliation doesn't kill. It announces, betrayal doesn't bury, it exposes, and discernment doesn't just protect, it prophesies. You walked through fire and emerged unshakable, a living testament that integrity, patience, and spiritual strategy are more powerful than any attack or attempt at discrediting. If this message resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss content that awakens the mind and strengthens the spirit. Like, comment, and share this video to spread the truth and inspire others to rise above every attempt to diminish them. Stay awakened, chosen ones.